It should be a little better for those on Zoom. Just give me a second to get myself set up. Thank you, Keita, for reading that slightly awkward passage with names that we don't necessarily get to hear very often or are very familiar with. I'm going to preface this time just by saying that this week has been a very difficult week for myself, health-wise, and with situations at home, at our accommodation that have, I guess, been extremely ableist and discriminatory and difficult to manage. And so trying to prepare something to say in the midst of things like that doesn't always quite go as planned. And so even 2 days in bed with, let's say, diarrhea and certain other not feeling great, it's been a challenge. And I want to say that that honestly is the reality of disability for a lot of people, myself included, even though I may not visually look disabled. I've dealt with various health issues for many years. I've had asthma and eczema since I was about 3 years old. I found out that I was hard of hearing in about 2006. Before that, I had absolutely no idea until someone said to me, "Did you hear that?" And I said, "Hear what?" And there goes the story of discovering hearing issues. And most recently, as well as mental health issues throughout my life, I've been learning to live with complex chronic diseases. And one of those complex chronic issues is myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is more commonly known as chronic fatigue syndrome. And so you add all that kind of background into this past week or so, and then trying to prepare for this time. So I have a very incomplete sermon, and I am learning to be okay with that. It's very difficult because I want to present a side of myself that looks energetic and is put together and has a nice rounded sermon with a nice wonderful conclusion that we will then take away and think about. I'm sure we will get some of those things. Some of it is on paper, particularly when it comes to my research to do with the Bible. But there's also a lot that has been going on up here that I do not have written down or necessarily in words. So that's where I'm at today, and I'm okay with that, and you shall be okay with that too. I'm getting signals. Did I turn the mic on? We're trying something a little different here for hopefully YouTube and all the rest of it when it gets put out. So some of you may actually be wondering, despite the references to disability in this passage, why on earth would someone even choose to look at an Old Testament narrative, especially when we have the New Testament and it talks about Jesus, and Jesus has come and he performs miracles and healings and wonderful things. Why is that not something that, why are we not focusing on that? Well, for starters, I love the Old Testament. But I like this story, this narrative of Mephibosheth, because it does not involve a healing. It is not a nicely put together narrative that ends in some kind of miracle. And I have a firm belief that stories can change our perceptions. They challenge our preconceptions, our prejudices, our biases, and they force us to actually engage with real lives, with reality. It takes us beyond the theory and into practice and experience. So, Mephibosheth, how many of you up until this point have actually heard a sermon on Mephibosheth? Ooh, wow, there's actually hands. This is wonderful. I didn't actually expect that at all. Oh, we have some hands. Okay, yeah, Kim and Kevin. Yeah, there's been sermons, and but the reality is that it is actually a rarely mentioned or studied narrative in the church. And even if it is focused on, in fact, let me say this, if you do a search of YouTube of sermons related to Mephibosheth, they predominantly center around the so-called charitable actions of King David and his benevolence toward the dead dog from Lo-debar, that is Mephibosheth. They tend to spiritualize the narrative, that is, the names of the characters are used often as metaphors to express themes of God's grace and mercy. Therefore, Mephibosheth, whose name means from the mouth of shame or dispeller of shame, is invited from the ghetto of Lo-debar, the place of no thing or no pasture, to the king's table. You fill in the gaps there. One preacher said, "We are all Mephibosheth, spiritually crippled and imperfect. God requires perfection, which we don't meet. Mephibosheth was the enemy of David, and Jesus went to the cross for his enemy. We deserve death just like Mephibosheth." Or I quote, "When you sit at the table," I have to do actions here, "when you sit at the table, your lameness is covered." Yes, if you're like me, feel free to get out your puke bags at that. You see, one thing is that they fail to mention any negative character attributes of David. They gloss over the contradictions, the manipulation, the power dynamics, and my favorite, as always, the context. I should have numbered these pieces of paper. If you're ever up here preaching and stuff, it's always good to number your pages. Or have all the pages, maybe. It went away. What happened? Okay. So let me tell you briefly the story. You've heard it read from the Bible, but I'm probably going to just fill in some of the gaps to do with this story. So the nomadic Israelites, they finally begin to settle in what was called the Promised Land. They are ruled by a succession of priests, of prophets, and of judges. So there's not necessarily, even though judges tend to take sort of a top role, there was still the involvement of a lot of priests and prophets in the leadership. But under the prophet Samuel, despite being warned against such a choice, the Israelites demand to be ruled by a king, just like the other nations. So Saul, from the tribe of Benjamin, is anointed to become the first king of Israel. However, this does not go very well. Saul disobeys God, and God rejects Saul as king. So while Saul is still king, the prophet Samuel secretly anoints a young shepherd boy called David to be the next king. When David shows up in battle and defeats the Philistine giant Goliath, Saul appoints David as a high-ranking military officer, sending him on various campaigns. And due to David's military success, Saul becomes jealous, becomes suspicious, and he becomes fearful of David, making several attempts to try and kill him. And so, when David is fleeing for his life, Jonathan, who is one of Saul's sons, makes David swear on oath to look after his descendants in the event of Jonathan's death. At this time, Saul continues his pursuit of David, but ultimately Saul and Jonathan are killed. When the words of their deaths reaches the nurse of Jonathan's 5-year-old son, Mephibosheth, she picks him up and flees. In her haste, she drops Mephi, resulting in injuring his feet. A bunch of other stuff happens, and we are told this is something that, like I said, context often gets mixed. But a bunch of other stuff happens, and in 2 Samuel chapter 8, verses 15, which is just 3 verses before we get the story of Mephibosheth in the whole of that chapter 9, it says, David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Okay, so remember that. We're told David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Really? Is that what happened? So David is established as a king over Judah and Israel. He learns of Mephibosheth's survival from Ziba, a servant of Saul's household. He summons Mephibosheth from his home in Lodabar to Jerusalem, promising to show him loyalty for the sake of his father Jonathan. David gives to Mephibosheth all that belonged to Saul. Sounds good. And he has Ziba and his family and his servants work the land to provide food for Mephibosheth, while also giving Mephibosheth a permanent place at the royal table. Again, sounds great, right? David's son, Absalom, ends up revolting, and David is forced to now flee Jerusalem. Ziba, this servant, informs David that Mephibosheth has remained in Jerusalem. Now, this is going beyond the text of what we actually read, because there's several places that Mephibosheth sort of shows up within the narrative. So Ziba informs David that Mephibosheth has remained in Jerusalem in hopes that Saul's kingdom will be restored. Now, David's response is to give Saul's entire field and that inheritance over to the servant Ziba. And David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Really, David? Did you really? When David returns from exile, you read this in chapter 19 of 2 Samuel, there are 3 people who go to meet David at Gilgal before he crosses the Jordan River and then back into Jerusalem. There is Shimei, the son of Gera, Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, and Barzillai the Gibeonite. All have had very specific interactions with David around promises, oaths, and the support of the kingship. At this point, Mephibosheth tells David that Ziba has slandered him. Ziba lied to the king. So David revises his earlier decision and divides the field between Mephibosheth and Ziba. Here endeth the story of Mephibosheth. And David reigned over all Israel, doing what was right and just for all his people. Did he? Did he really? Later, in 1 Kings chapter 2, so we're going even further along in the history of Israel. David is in the midst of giving over his kingship to his son Solomon. And he instructs Solomon to kill Joab, that is David's nephew, because of previous betrayals. He tells Solomon, despite the promise that David made at the Jordan River to not kill Shimei, Solomon can punish him and do what he likes. And he says, but show kindness to the sons of Barzillai of Gilead, and let them be among those who eat at your table. They stood by me when I fled from your brother Absalom. And Mephibosheth, who's Mephibosheth? He does not get mentioned ever again. I find it interesting sometimes, not what is included in a text, but what is omitted from a text. And David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Really? There is an old Bible commentary from the 19th century by Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown. It's on Joshua and Esther. They actually did the whole Bible. They say that Jerome, which I think he was like one of the early church fathers or whatever in the history of Christianity, Jerome says that the later Jews believed the division of David's kingdom was an act done by the retributive justice of providence for the unequal measure awarded Mephibosheth. I didn't know that. That when God allowed the division of the kingdom after Solomon, it was because David did not do right by Mephibosheth. So I don't know what your take on this story and this text is. I don't know what questions you are asking or thinking. When I look at this text and this story, having heard so many times how many sermons, if there are sermons out there, that people see David in this amazing light and fail to see the injustice. As a church, I think we also are often guilty of looking at the way we have conducted ourselves through history when it comes to issues of disability justice. And we kind of pat ourselves on the back for we put in a ramp. But did we? Did we really do what is right and just? And it brings us, I think, to the question of, well, what do we do now? What are we going to do now? It's taken me a while to even get used to the concept of categorizing myself as disabled. And I have really appreciated this opportunity for us as a church to look at disability justice. It is a conversation that is continuing to come to the surface. We've had our conversations about queerness and theology, and those are ongoing, right? We know the church isn't necessarily there, but disabled people or disability justice has not been a topic that has really been examined or looked at in any depth. And that is a sad state of affairs. So when I look at this text, and you will have these questions in your bulletin, these are the things that I think about upon reading this text and contemplating, what does this mean for us, this Old Testament narrative? So I think, what does it actually mean to be included? We talk a lot about inclusion, particularly as queer folks and churches. We're an affirming church. What does that mean? What does it mean that we are affirming and inclusive? What does inclusion mean? Is inclusion enough? If I was Mephibosheth, I mean, that's kind of hard to imagine, but even imagine yourself as you are, able-bodied, disabled, temporarily able-bodied, whatever it is. Imagine you're invited to this dinner at some person's rich home. What does that feel like for you? Does it feel like inclusion? Does it feel like you belong? Is it justice? Is it equity? Is it equality? Do I feel like I am on the same level as the person that has invited me? David was a king. Mephibosheth could have inherited the kingdom. He was kind of, in some ways, a threat, but he wasn't, because he was disabled. He was out of the playing field. And so if being invited to the table to eat in the king's palace, if that doesn't feel like belonging as a disabled person, then it is not belonging. It is not inclusion. And so I think, what might it look like for us here at Open Way to not just extend an invitation, not just extend an invitation to include everyone at the table. Maybe what we need to actually do is let go of the table. I'm just going to read a quote that is from this book. Its title itself gave me a little bit of inspiration. It's called From Inclusion to Justice. It's recently just been published. Mere inclusion fails to undo or expose the reliance of Christian leadership on a theology of ability. It is not enough for the church to invite disabled people to an existing table. Rather, they must be willing to let go of the table. I'll read that sentence again. It is not enough for the church to invite disabled people to an existing table. Rather, they must be willing to let go of the table.
Sonya, thank you so much for sharing not only from your biblical study and the sermons we